Hello, hello. Is this thing on? Can you hear me? Cool. Yep. Hey, thanks everyone for coming out. Sorry we're getting started a little bit late. Appreciate your patience. Quick shout out to all of our sponsors. Thanks to AtTask for bringing us food and hosting us a place to meet. Appreciate that. Also to Front End Masters, O'Reilly, and Egghead for the perks that they give our memberships. There's some information up here on the board, or also I email it out every once in a while, just how you can get the discount codes for those perks. Other announcements, ng-conf tickets go on sale tomorrow at noon. I think they're $750. They'll sell out quick, so if you're interested, that's tomorrow. And I think that's all I can think of. Our first talk is Chris Esplin. I'm going to talk about AngularFire. Yep. And then we also have a talk by Randle Murphy on directives. And then I think we have a few lightning talks as well. And if you didn't talk to me beforehand and you want to do a lightning talk, feel free to come up after the main talks and you can do a lightning talk then also. So I'll turn the time over to Chris.
Oh, that's awesome. What happened to me? YO guest? And no password? Ah, shoot.
Guest and Lavender.
Guest. This is going to be a really long talk if the internet doesn't work. Is this guy? This guy. This? Hey. All right. This is going to be fun. Okay, so how many of you guys are familiar with Firebase? Wow, it's awesome. You got anyone using it in production yet? Come on, guys, nobody? I've used it a little bit in production, but I'm writing my first big effort right now. And that's what I'd like to present on. It's not all the way to production. There's still a few kinks got to work out, but I'm getting pretty close. I've got some sites up in it right now, but yeah. Okay. So this site, ChristopherEsplin.com, is currently running off of Firebase. And I want to talk about the CMS I'm writing, which is this. And I'm calling it Quiver CMS. That's all up there. Anyway. Okay. So, how many of you guys have used like NoSQL solutions as your data store? So, fair number of people are getting pretty comfortable with it. Okay. So I got into Firebase without any NoSQL experience really, and I've spent a lot of time learning how to use Firebase as a NoSQL solution. It can kind of mess with you a little bit if you're used to relational databases. You really have to plan out your structure completely differently. And I found this to be a very, very powerful way to prototype your applications quickly. So the main advantage to using Firebase for me is I can use AngularFire with it. AngularFire is their Angular library that wraps up Firebase references and lets you interact with them natively through Angular. So the beauty of that is I get to effectively set up my models in my Angular views. So I hook up, I can get a three-way bind going all the way from Firebase through AngularFire to my Angular view, and then I get three-way binding all the way back and forth. So once I get that ref set up, I can add to it in the view as I like, and I can add and delete and change it right there in the view. And a lot of times I don't even have to write any functions to do it. I just add to the model in my Angular view. For those of you who've used Firebase or used AngularFire pre 0.8.0, a lot of things have changed with their implementation, and they've really changed for the better. We now have casting as objects or casting as arrays, and we're getting much stronger, much stronger situation here. Okay, so I'd like to talk about how I've managed to offset some of the issues with AngularFire. So with Firebase, you pay per connected user. So up to about 50 connected users, you can be in their free tier. But above that, if your 90th percentile of connected users goes above that, you have to move into a paid tier. It's surprising how many people you can have on your site off and on and still stay below 50 connected users. But if you've got a large blog or you're intending to have a lot of people using your application, you've got to think about that. How much money are you going to be spending on Firebase? So with this application, I've written the entire back end as a separate app. So the back end is an AngularFire, pure AngularFire, single-page application. But only admins and people who are actually in the act of purchasing a product ever hit that part of the application. The rest of the main public-facing part of the application is an Express app that uses Firebase as a back-end data store and caches the data in Redis and Elasticsearch. So instead of having every single user hitting my Firebase at all times, the majority of users are going to hit the main page. So for instance, this guy right here. And if I refresh this page, I get this straight off of my Redis cache. And if the cache is not warmed up, I still don't hit Firebase for it. I just pull some, if the cache isn't warm, I already have the data in my Express app, and I just render it, stash it in Firebase or in Redis, and I don't touch it again for another week. So with this sort of architecture, you can really quickly get tons of scale out of an app like this with just handlebars templates. This is all handlebars. But it's just a single Firebase connected user. And I don't even hit it that often. So yeah, I was running into a problem with this because, so a little bit about me and my background. So my wife and I run a business. I used to work here at Task, but I quit and went to work with my wife on this business that we run. It's a calligraphy teaching business. And so I wrote an app originally in PHP, and it was a PHP CRUD app, wrote this app. Eventually I wrote an API for it and put Angular on top of it. And I ran into crazy problems with SEO. I mean, if you ever tried to SEO an Angular app, I managed to do it, but I had to write a ton of custom code to do it. I had to run my own server to render the pages, save those renders in Redis, and give those renders to Google. And it was a real mess. And while I now know how to do that, I'd much prefer not to have to deal with that. And so my solution is this sort of hybrid architecture where you do your public-facing stuff, render it in handlebars off Express, but use Firebase still as the data store. But then when you go to edit that data, you're live in an AngularFire single-page application. And the big advantage of that first is SEO and speed. So the end user most of the time is getting handlebars templates super fast, right out of memory. The second advantage is on the opposite end of the spectrum, when I'm in the admin part of the site, when I'm over here creating products or writing something. Well, this is nice and slow. When I'm working, usually this works faster than this. And building out the single page application, I don't actually have to think about the data store. I just create Firebase refs and connect them to my views and spend all my time writing views. A lot of the resulting controllers, I don't know if you guys, you guys that use Angular, familiar with controllers. Like this is how simple a controller can be for this sort of situation. I'm passing in a products ref and a files ref. And for products here, I cast it as an array using the new 0.8.0 API. So Angular will now treat products as an array. Therefore, if I need to add a product, I actually have to do that or remove it. I have to do it manually through a function here. I have to say, hey, new product, slugify, blah, 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 and then $add the new product in. And if I want to remove a product, I take the whole product object, pass it into the $remove, and it's gone. But then for files, this is more of an object. So I just cast it as an object, and it's attached to my files on scope. I never have to think about it again. So I can track, these things will all update in place. So I can update them in place in my view, and it persists across the whole application. So yeah, saved a ton of time writing controllers with this methodology. The other thing you can do that's really nice is you can do, once you've got, so this is a single direction bind from that object. So it binds the object down, but it won't bind back. I can alternatively do something like this. Okay, so this is casting it out as an object, then using the $bind to bind it to my scope and files. And I don't need it in this particular controller, but in a lot of other spots, I'll do this, and it'll just be a one-liner. And now I've got the three-way bind all the way from the view back to the data store. Okay. So creating these little references to Firebase is pretty straightforward once you fuss with it a little bit. For example, I've got this guy here, words. Content, words. So that's where I'm writing all my articles, whatever. So I access it from my endpoint, which in this case is dev quiver / quiver CMS. I can access it via /content/words. And that gets me a Firebase ref, a native JavaScript Firebase ref right here. And then I wrap it in $Firebase to get an AngularFire reference. And that what gives me the as-object, as-array functionality. And so all of my Firebase refs actually come out of this one admin service. And I just pass them out. So to get words, it's just /content/words. To get a word, it's /content/words plus the key. And I can grab that down. Have any of you guys ever tried to iterate, that have used this, tried iterating over an old Firebase object, like an ng-repeat? You notice how you lose track of the IDs? It's tricky to keep track of the IDs, and you have to use the object, like Angular's object repeater, which doesn't let you do the filter bys and the order bys and all the stuff you're used to, which just drove me nuts. And so the last time I talked about this here, they hadn't released the new update, and I was still fighting that. And I worked all these great ways to get around it, but it was annoying. Now that we can cast things as array, you don't have to worry about it anymore. You get your filter by, you get everything. It actually treats it as an array. It's a decorated array, so there's a whole bunch of other functionality tacked onto it. But when Angular sees it, it just sees the array, and it loops through it. Downside, you don't get as much live in-place editing with the array as you used to. You still get it with the object, but when you cast things as an array, you don't get that. So if you're wondering why these things here, why words all have these crazy keys, the only reason for that is because Firebase cannot handle zero-indexed arrays very well, just for data integrity purposes. You wouldn't want multiple people trying to push to an array. If you're doing it at the same time, it'd screw the keys up. So words, this words object here, is sort of a Firebase pseudo array that when you it's a regular Firebase object. When you cast it as an array, it gets rid of these guys, replaces them from Angular's perspective with a zero-indexed array. But that's why it's one-directional, and that's why I have to call add product and remove product off of that. But yeah. So yeah, do you guys have any questions about Firebase or how this works? Yeah.
Sorting and filtering. Can you get back, paginated results off of that?
You can, but not with AngularFire, which has been really frustrating to me. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope they get that. My other answer is if you need paginated results, you can get them. You can route it through your backend, which I've had to do. So I've definitely routed stuff in my backend. Yeah. You had one? Oh, for Firebase? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that applies to AngularFire yet, but yeah, that's really cool, and they've got better query tools coming out for sure. Yeah, what was your?
Yeah, actually, my question's not about AngularFire or Firebase, but I wanted to know about your setup when you're talking about your Redis cache.
Yes.
I wanted to know how you handle cache invalidation. How do you know?
Oh, yeah, that's always a good one. With this app, it's actually pretty straightforward. I do it manually. Okay, I didn't really explain a lot about what this app is. This app is a content management system with a backend, kind of like like a WordPress, but on the front end, you've got whole e-commerce. You can create products, you can sell products, and they've got I'm working on a subscriptions system, and there's like a block associated with it. So I'm the only one really updating the data, so I just manage the cache manually. Yeah, and then I'll have like a week timeout, time to live on the Redis instances. But yeah, yeah.
How do you set up your Elasticsearch? I heard you on that.
Yeah, really surprisingly easy. So I just did it you just install Elasticsearch on the, you can just install Elasticsearch on your server. So my DigitalOcean VPS, I got Elasticsearch and Redis running. And every time the server starts up, the first thing it does is it calls down a bunch of Firebase refs. And as soon as it gets values for those, on some of them, it'll take those values and index them into Elasticsearch. Then every time the onValue event happens and the values change, it re-indexes them and wipes out the old version. So I just have it sitting there in my VPS, and I have a really simple little node utility that just queries it. And all this stuff's open source. I mean, I've got it out there on my blog, and it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. Any more questions at this point? I've got a little more I can talk about in terms of how to serve a single-page application and static pages side by side seamlessly. But yeah.
Actually, this one's a question about Firebase. So when you were talking earlier about having to plan carefully the structure of your data.
Yeah.
When you put it in. When you find you need to use that data in a separate way that you hadn't preconceived, how do you approach that, or how would you approach that?
I end up going through my views and having to change my references into it, and that's just annoying.
Do you ever add is there a way to kind of add another data structure with pointers to other?
Oh, to redirect?
Yeah.
Not really, no. Yeah, you don't get that. You don't get that. And the real reason for needing to think through a little bit until you get a feel for it is the security rules. So the security rules are like the biggest blessing and the biggest gotcha all at the exact same time. So once you get it figured out, the security rules are fantastic. But until it clicks, it's kind of tricky because you're putting your security rules into Firebase at the data store level. There are other ways you can do it. So some of my stuff I secure through my Express server, and I manage that security myself. Because the Express server's got admin rights to all the data, pulls anything down, and then I serve it up piecemeal. But I want to show you guys what the security rules look like. Okay, so my security rules for this Quiver CMS app is, if your name is chris@quiver.is, your email is, you can read and write everything. Otherwise, you get read rules, and then I've done a little bit with auth IDs here so that users can access their own data. But if you look at how I had to structure the data for the users, you'll notice there's a private and a public node on this object. Because once you grant access to part of a node to a user, they get all the children automatically. So that's okay if you're going in and granting access at the very lowest level of your data. But if you want to grant access to chunks of data, they have to be in their own nodes. So I've got private here. I've got some customer data for charging, and then an isAdmin flag, which I use in my security rules to see if they're admins. And then public, it's not really public. The users can read and edit their own data if it's in this public tree. Yeah. So that's the big sort of catch if you're not careful about it. If you just start throwing your data out flat and you don't sort of silo it into public and private segments like this, you can get in a little bit of trouble. And I've had to do some small refactors just to sort of break stuff out. That really end up just having to go into all my views and going user.public.email, user.public. And just drop the public in there to change the path. Because really, I'm speccing almost all this out in the view. There's so little happening in those controllers. Super, super thin. And really, I don't even have services much anymore. I only have a couple of services in this whole app. It's almost all bundled up there with Firebase. Any more questions on this stuff? There's something that I think would be interesting to talk about is how to structure. You guys can't read this URL at all, can you? No, shoot. Yep, some baloney. Here, I'll show you guys. That makes even more sense. Jump. Okay. So I actually spent quite a bit of time figuring out how to do this hybrid architecture with Node Express server running on the same server, same SSL keys as my Angular single page application. Kind of tricky. But I ended up with this solution here. With you guys, I'm assuming you guys are familiar with Nginx for the most. A lot of people are. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you can do this in Apache as well. But the trick here is to proxy your locations out based on path. So anything that's got a /app/images, libs, scripts, styles, or views goes just proxied straight out to my CMS server that's running the actual Angular application. Anything that starts with API also gets proxied to that same address, but I drop off the API, so I don't have to keep track of that. So these two paths all go out to the server that's running the CMS, or the back end. And then everything else is just assumed to go to the content server, which is just merely templating out my handlebars templates and serving them up and caching them. Yeah. Got some mistakes?
Well, you can fix up the SSL for sure. You don't want SSL 3 to increase.
Right.
Over 150 lines of Nginx code.
We'll have to talk to you about this because I'm not an Nginx expert by any means. I just know that I got the sucker working after a couple of days of fussing with it. Yeah, not the easiest thing in the world to do. But this architecture has been really nice because it's actually two servers running. So you can't see this either. Got NodeMon running a content server and running a CMS server. And so I've got two different servers running so that I can drop the CMS server on the back end and the content server is still templating out stuff regardless. The goal is to get to sort of that 12-factor app type architecture where the parts can exist on their own. I can spin up the app server, I can spin up the content server, and they can be turned on and off individually and exist independently. Yeah. Anyway, guys have any more questions? No? Okay. So that's it then. I've got a ton of Firebase swag up here if you want to steal that.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. The secret is I'm super nervous. So if you want to talk back to me as I'm talking up here, I don't mind. It might make me feel less nervous. I talk too much anyway. I'm Murphy Randle. Can you hear me? Is this on? Thanks. I think that I work with technology for a living, but I don't know. Oh, haha. Okay. There we go. Hello. Good? Great. I'm Murphy Randle. I work at Space Monkey. At Space Monkey, has anyone heard of Space Monkey here? Maybe? We make devices that make a distributed kind of cloud storage solution rather than a database or a data center-centric cloud storage solution. So if you're interested in doing that kind of thing, come and talk to me. But there, I'm in charge of managing, maintaining our current web services and making new web services. We use Angular for many apps. And I have a little story to tell. Recently, I was going to add a couple buttons to the settings page for one of our apps. And I had one of those moments where a very small task turned into a very large task in my mind. Because, tell me, have any of you had a controller in Angular that is more than 50 lines? Yeah? Unlikely, right? Unlikely you'd have a controller that's more than 50 lines. I think that some of you are lying. Because honestly, in my experience, the easiest thing to do when you start using Angular is to put everything in the controller. You're like, hey, my jQuery goes here. Or like, I'll just throw all my functions in here. And then I'll call everything from the scope because it's so easy to use two-way data binding. Boo. Yeah, you should be booing me right now. OK, great. So let's talk about this for a second, because I had two buttons to add. And these two buttons, you think of buttons and how simple they are to use. There may be one state on the button. You click it, it does something, that's it. These are toggle buttons that I was doing. So there are two states to track here with these buttons. There's on and off. But with two buttons, all of a sudden, that's four possible states, right? One's on, one's off. Both are on, both are off, and the other way around. OK, that gets a little more complicated. Now let's add in the fact that I'm querying an API on the back end. And there's a chance that, well, first of all, there's a time between when the user clicks the button and the button either responds or doesn't. So that's another state to keep track of, a pending state for each button. And then there's a possibility that the request might fail. You click the button and nothing happens. So now we're not talking about just two buttons. We're talking about a combination of, I didn't count how many that was, 16 states, is it? OK. That's a lot to handle, especially if you're going to be responsible and make the kind of app that tells the user everything that's going on. That says, hey, be patient, get a cookie, I'm loading right now. Or, oh no, there was a problem with the server, sorry, we're terrible, send us an email, those kind of things. It's really easy to blow past those things and forget them, especially when you're making an MVP-style app. But we don't do that, because we're good engineers. So we also don't want to throw a bunch of variables on our scope to be tracking 16 states, or 8 states, or whatever it is, because that makes us a controller that's extremely hard to follow logically, messy to look at and read, and just, you kind of feel like you're a bad person. At least I do when I do that. I'm like, I'm going to drive out of work today. I'm going to hit some dogs on the way home, or something like that. I'm a bad person. So I decided not to do that, and instead read up a little bit. In fact, I already knew that I should do this, but I hadn't in the past. Studied up on custom directives, because Angular is built completely out of directives. And once again, the beginner's approach is to utilize the built-in Angular directives everywhere, because they're there, they're documented, they're easy to use. But you can also end up making some complicated things out of simple directives in a complicated way. That's hard to read when you come back later. Very complicated. So Angular's intention was, hey, let's all use these custom directives to make our own things, not just use the ones that were built in. And in case anyone didn't know, I'm sure everyone did, especially if you listen to JavaScript Jabber, but did you know that even the ng-app directive is an Angular custom directive? You can go look at the source. It's built on Angular's directive system. Pretty much all of Angular's HTML directives are built on top of Angular's directive system. So let's leverage that for ourselves. So if we were to make special, oh, this is on the other side. If we were to make special directives for this button situation we were talking about, maybe we could make a directive that's a button, a toggle button, that takes attributes in the tag. Maybe those attributes could be a function you pass into the attribute that returns a promise. And maybe that promise can tell the button when what is happening when. And so maybe if that promise is unfulfilled, you're in a pending state. And maybe if that promise is rejected, there's an error to render. And maybe if that promise is accepted, you should show that the request completed. So if we made a custom directive from that, all of a sudden, instead of having to track 3 different states for a button on the scope and for each different button, we have one element that has its own isolate scope and all of those functions built in automatically. So now you just have one function to put on your scope, pass that into the element, and you're done. Makes things a lot easier, makes things a lot more readable. So that's the idea. And today, I'd like to go through with you. I'm going to try to do it live. If I mess up, when I mess up, I'd like to hear a bunch of boos from the crowd and tell me what I'm doing wrong, OK? Because I practiced this a couple times, and as I was practicing, I put things in the wrong place and stuff. So, OK, great. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a directive called the Mr. box. Mr. stands for Murphy Randle. I'm so creative. And this MR box, this Mr. box, the idea is that you can pass in a function that returns a promise as an attribute on the directive. And this function is in charge of doing whatever you want it to do. Probably it's most useful to fetch some data, to prepare some state, and set that on the controller scope. That's the most useful thing I can think of to have it do. So you can create a function that maybe goes to the server, maybe can fetch an ID of a user or something like that, and set it on the scope. Now, before we go any further, and before I get booed, I know, Angular router can already do this. It's got an attribute called resolve, right? You pass in a function that returns a promise to the resolve function, but it doesn't have any user interaction during that resolving. All it does is sit there, it freezes up the UI, the user's like, what's going on? I don't know, I guess I'll get a cookie. They come back, and then they close your app because it's still not loaded, and they want to go to iwastesomuchtime.com. But we don't want that to happen. So instead, we're going to use this MR box. We're going to pass in this function that gets the state for us, and also we're going to tell it what to show the user while it's loading. And then we're going to tell it what to show to show the user if there's an error. Yeah, losers. And then we're going to tell it also what to show the user if there's success. All those 3 things will pass in. Let's do this together, OK? So steps are, let's get a working directive going. Has anyone not written a custom directive before in this room? OK, cool. Well, we're going to start from writing it from nothing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add in the functionality of passing a function with a promise. We'll go ahead and define loading and error messages. We'll talk a little bit about transclusion. Anyone not know what transclusion is? OK, a few people. Great. And then if we have time, we're going to talk about how to test a directive. Does everyone test their directives religiously? Yes. I will indoctrinate you. Maybe I won't. We'll see. All right, let's start out here. I've got some stuff pre-set up. You know cooking shows, how they always have the ingredients there, and they're perfect, and that's the hardest part of cooking anyway, is getting the ingredients together. I just did that to you. I'm sorry. What I've done is I've set up the app here. I'm going to go hit some dogs on the way home. OK, I've got the HTML set up here. I'm linking in JavaScript for our custom directive. You can see some CSS I've already done, and the JavaScript here. But don't worry, we haven't written any of the directive stuff yet, except for, you'll see. All right, here's a controller that we've got linked into our Angular app. I've got some modules defined up here. And here I've got a couple of functions already set up. One of them, oh, I'm sorry. First, let's talk. Here are a couple variables on the scope that are just for the sake of developing the app. One of them is an image URL. We're simulating having to make a round trip to a server to load an image, maybe, or maybe a JSON request, OK? And then here's a function that waits for 2 seconds and then resolves that, returns a promise that resolves, and we'll set the scope.image URL to a valid URL. Here's a different function for testing that will wait a second and then it'll resolve, or I'm sorry, it'll reject the function. So that way we can make sure everything is working correctly. User verified before we do automated tests, okay? This is not TDD. This is like T after the D. This is like T after the fact. I don't know what the acronym is for that, okay? How the real world works. Take it, Ruby people. I'm just kidding. I love Ruby people. Okay, so first thing let's do is make a directive here. We're going to call it mrbox. It's not going to work because it's not hooked into anything, but at least we know what we want the API to look like. Okay, we've got nothing there. That's because there is actually nothing inside of my JavaScript file for the directive. But I do have a template set up. I just wanted to tell you that I'm cheating a little bit. Here's the HTML we already have set up as a template for the directive. We'll get back to that in a minute. So to start out making the directive here, let's go ahead and do angular.module. And if you see right here, I already have a module created called mr-directives. Here's a little tip in case you're doing testing. I like to put everything that's not the app inside of a module that's not the app module for the sake of not having to deal with apps and routing and testing when I'm doing unit tests. You just stick it in a different module and you're good to go. So we're going to say mr dot, what was it called? Directives? Directives. And then we're going to say dot directive. That makes sense. Let's give it a name. Now, Angular's got its funny name transformation here where it turns something that's camel case. Is that camel case? Camel case into dashes, right? So I didn't know this, but HTML is case insensitive. Surprise. So that's why Angular does it. Here we've got mr-box, and then anything with a capital in it will be translated by Angular into something that is prefixed with a dash. So when you're translating between HTML, JavaScript, make sure you get your capitalization right, or else you'll be scratching your head going, why doesn't it work? Or ripping your hair out, which is what I do more often. Okay, now let's pass a function in. Good old anonymous functions, and from that function we'll return an object. This is the object that describes the directive. First thing I always do is set the restrict attribute. This is just going to be an element. I'm not going to worry about assigning the mrbox as an attribute on anything, just an element. Dedication to just elements. I'm just kidding. No IE. That's right. That's another thing I'm dedicated to is killing IE. Don't hire me if you use IE6. Okay. Thank you. All right. So restrict, and then the other thing we need to get this to start working is a template. Template, URL, and I've got it memorized /mrbox/mrbox.html. I've typed that like 20 times. So that's practicing. Not 20. That's an exaggeration. Oh, look. Look. There's a little. Hey, you can't even see this. I'm sorry. Is that big enough? That's better, right? Yeah. Can you read it now? Sorry about that. OK, we've got a little bit of color on here. That means that this is getting rendered in, but let's go ahead and give it some something to render, like hello world. Great. All right. So we've got a directive now. We've got a custom directive. But this is kind of defeating the purpose, because what we wanted is to have a custom directive that would render after a function that returns a promise is completed, right? So let's go ahead and add that in. Now, who knows what isolate scope is? Yeah? Who doesn't know what isolate scope is? Make sure you raise the other hand so I don't get confused. OK, great. Isolate scope, let's pretend that your controller scope is a big piece of cookie dough, a big roll of cookie dough. And that the isolate scope then would be you taking the cookie dough cutter, cutting out a little piece of the cookie dough, and taking it with you into the directive journey. Directive. That's a terrible analogy. OK, let's pretend. OK. I'm sorry, that's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. That was transclusion anyway. So it was both a bad analogy and it was the wrong part of the talk, OK? So instead, let's talk about isolate scope. Isolate scope, Angular arranges its scopes kind of like a tree. So you got the root scope, and all other scopes on controllers and directives sit somewhere below that root scope. And they all inherit from it, typically. So if I'm a controller and I try to access scope.funnycats, and it's not on my own scope, Angular will look on my parent scopes above me to try to find that object, make it accessible to me. That's just how it works by default. But directives with an isolate scope cut off that connection entirely. So what we do here is we say scope. We give it an empty object. We're saying, hey, you have no contact with the outside world. go sit in a dark room, and I'm going to lock the door. Except these small rays of light that we're going to pass in. We give it some attributes here. These attributes on this object will be reflected inside of attributes on the custom directive in the DOM. They're little open communication slots between the parent scope and the isolate scope. So here we're going to make one called the resolve fin. It follows the same naming conventions that the directive name does up here. Okay? And then here we're going to pass a funny string that means funny things. The way this works is that we're going to tell Angular that when it looks for an attribute on a custom directive, it should interpret it in a certain way. That's what these strings mean. This reference, sorry, it's not a reference. This ampersand represents an expression. So that it'll look at the value that's being passed into the attribute, and it'll treat it as an expression. This confused me for a while because I saw this, and naturally, having done plenty of C++ in my past, I thought, it's just a reference. It's perfect. I can pass in a function. But it's not. It's actually an expression. So make sure you don't forget that, because we'll use it in just a minute here. So we said, OK, you have an isolate scope. You've got a little window to the outside that's called resolve function, and you're going to treat it as an expression. So let's go ahead into our HTML here, and let's add an attribute called resolve-fin. And we're going to say it equals the name of the function that we want to call on the parent scope, waits and resolves, plus we're going to invoke it, since this is an expression, right? We're going to pass in an expression that will invoke the function. Now, that expression will return the same value that the function returns. So we're going to get a promise inside of our controller scope to work with, which is fantastic. Okay, so we've got that going now. It's getting passed in. Let's go in and make a controller for our custom directive to use that with, okay? I don't know what I'm doing here. This is crazy. Controller, and let's pass in a scope. Scope. Okay, with that scope, with this scope, we will do heroic things. Resolve function. Okay, we're going to call it. So that calls the expression. And then we're going to get back from the, what? It did not, because it's an expression. Once again, you set up an expression in the view that calls a function, but it doesn't get evaluated when you set it up in the view. It just gets passed in as an expression that's wrapped. Angular wraps it in an object. So if you're going to call it here, it only gets called when you actually call it on this controller scope, okay?
The scope you're passing in there is the one you define as the mode.
Correct, exactly right. This scope that gets injected into the custom directive is this scope. And so resolve function is already defined on this custom scope. Cool? On the isolate scope. And
If you define controller above that?
the order does not matter, because if you see this as an object, we're just defining keys on an object. So what Angular does actually is it'll take this object, it'll examine it, compile it, make sure it understands everything the directive wants to do, and put everything in order then before it executes. So everything's in order, everything's fine there. It'll actually take the scope and inject it in. OK, so this returns a promise. So what we can do is we can say dot then, we can chain onto what this returns. So we'll say dot then, and we'll pass in a function for the success, for what happens when this promise succeeds. And what we'll do, I forgot. We have to set an attribute on the scope here to represent the state of the box, whether it's loading, whether it's failed, whether it's pending. So we're going to set it first to scope.state equals loading, because by default, this box that we have is going to be loading something, okay? So when the promise succeeds, we're going to set scope.state to loaded. And then if it fails, we'll pass in another function here, because that's how promises work. We're going to set the scope to error. So sad. I'm sorry, scope.state. Oh, I almost got booed. Scope.state is error. Great. So now everything in our controller is set up. But if you'll notice, nothing has changed in the view yet, right? So let's go in, change our view to take advantage of this. We only want our content to show up once the promise has resolved, right? So let's use our nifty little friend, ngIf. That's not how you do it. Div ngIf equals, and it was the name state, is equal to loaded, right? I speak English. Triple equals,
Not in Angular expressions.
Perfect. It's all right, I'll do it anyway, because that's what the cool kids do. I don't want to get beat up on the playground. All right, let's see if it works. Save it. Nothing's in the box. Something's in the box! Yeah! Yeah! Thank you! Thank you very much. It's still not very useful, though, because the user is sitting here going, where's the content? I don't understand. Oh, what? There it is. All right. So let's give them a little bit of help. Let's set up a state for loading in our view here. We'll say, if it's loading, then show loading. OK? Hey, it works. But we want that to be customizable. We don't want it to be hard-coded into the template. So let's go back again. Who knows what we're going to do? Just kidding. Let's go back into the, I know what we're going to do. Let's go back in here and let's add another attribute to the element. This one's going to be called loading MSG. Oh, that's a good one. Text is good. I'm going to do MSG because that's what I've done the whole time. And if I don't do it, I'm going to mess up. And then I'm going to get booed. So let's say loading pools white. OK? Great. There's a loading message. And while we're at it, let's also add an error message. Error message equals oh no's fire. OK, great. OK? But we have to define these on the scope, too. We're going to change this symbol to be the @ symbol. I don't know how you say that. How do you say that in English? Is there a word for that?
Arroba.
This is the ampersand. Arroba is how it is in Spanish. Is that?
No, it's English too. Arroba.
The arroba. We're going to add that in there, OK? Great. That means interpret the attribute as a string is what that means. And we called it loading MSG, right? Don't actually load MSG because it's bad for your stomach. We're going to change this to error MSG. Great. We've got 2 strings being passed in from attributes. And now we want to make use of them in our template. So, yeah.
Is there an advantage to passing it in on the scope rather than using the adders?
The only advantage is that I've practiced doing it this way, right? You can also do that if you want to set up a controller, or I'm sorry, if you want to
Add adders. I mean, you have three inputs to your directive, right? Scope,
Yeah.
element, and adders.
Perfect. You can also do that. You can access them on adders, or you can add to the scope. Either way. Yeah.
So the reason you might want to do it on the scope is then it's watched. And so like if you're passing it in as an expression, like in curly braces, then it'll automatically get updated in your directive.
Great point. So in this way, you could actually pass in a bound variable from your controller scope into the directive scope and have it update live. Very good. Thank you, Can't See Dodds. He's here all week, folks. OK. Here we're going to say loading MSG, and let's make one more state. By the way, if I'm going over time, let me know. I'm not really watching the clock. Error. All right, perfect. I'm sure you wanted to hear from me all night long.
Hey, you're not changing. You're using ng-aria. You can do the double colon. Single line.
What? Like this?
Right in front of error message.
Huh.
Inside, but right in front of it.
What is this madness? I come to teach and I learn. All right. Loading, please wait. Hello, world. Guys, it worked. And girls. Guys and girls, it worked. Yay! All right. But wait. There's more. We don't know if it works with rejecting promises yet. So let's hold our breath. Cross your fingers. It works too. This is so great. All right. But let's have a little bit more of a realistic situation here. Because remember, we set this content to hello world, right? That's not customizable, what we need it to be. So let's talk a little bit about transclusion. Transclusion. OK? Transclusion allows us to do a little bit of magic. You'll see that we don't have anything inside of our element here, but we want to have some stuff inside. For example, let's say I really wanted to take the parent scope value hello and print it out. So I'm just like, all right, fine. Hello, let's do that. And then it's like, oh, no, it's fine. Oh, there was an error. Come on, server. I'm going to fix the server, everybody. This is the fastest server fix you've ever seen. Boom. Oh, but it's still hello world. It's not showing us the message. And that's because we're not actually doing anything with the directive that allows us to pass something inside of the element here. So let's change that right now. Let's add an attribute onto the directive object that's called transclude. Transclude true. Boom. Everything just changed. Now let's get back to the cookie analogy we were having earlier. Let's say that the controller scope is a big ball of cookie dough. OK? Is this going to work this time? Yeah. Let's take take an ice cream scoop, scoop some of that cookie dough out, and take it with you into directive land. That's what transclusion is. Is it clear? You understand? Okay, perfect. What it does, transclusion allows you to take something that accesses the parent scope, put it inside of an isolate scope, and still allow it to access the parent scope. Okay? Because if we weren't transcluding, we would take something that references the parent scope, and without trying to use these little windows we made, put it inside the isolate scope, and it couldn't access anything. It couldn't access, because it can't access the parent scope. So by saying transclude, what we're telling Angular to do is take all the elements inside of this custom directive element and allow them to bind to elements or to variables on the controller scope, the parent scope. Okay? That's what transclusion does. Also, it takes care of taking the HTML from inside a custom directive and re-rendering it inside of another custom directive. Okay? Inside of your custom directive template where we tell it to. And that's what we're about to do right here. We are going to say ng transclude. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think you use it like that. I don't know if you can have it be a self-closing tag. Does anyone know about that?
I would use it just breaks IE.
Oh, use it. Okay, perfect. Oh, good. Well, I'm hoping to kill IE as much as I can. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm just kidding. I don't hate Microsoft. Hey, it worked. Hey there, Bob. It worked. Everyone, yay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. This is wonderful. All right. But now I want to, what did I do? Okay. Now, Mr. Box, that's what you said. Now I want to do something a little bit more serious. I don't want to just have a stupid string. I want to actually load an image. And here's our simulated image, right? In the success function, we're going to set the image URL. So let's go in here and let's say, get out of here, text, image, source equal. But it's not source. We're going to do ng source equal. And we're going to bind it to this attribute on the parent scope, which was image URL, image URL. Everyone hold your breath. Hey! Great. We did it. We did it. That's done. It's ready to use. But it's not ready to use until it's tested. Am I right? Am I right? There are no tests. It didn't happen. Okay. So I'm not actually going to live code the test part because I didn't practice it and I'm terrified. So I'm going to open up some git here. I'm going to get out of here. Oh, first, guess what? I'm going to git stash, okay? Is that cool? Git stash. We're just going to throw away all the work we just did. And we're going to check out the pre-made branch. So everyone, just put it in the oven for 2 hours, and on the other side, your cake will look like this. Hey, there it is! All right, great. So let's actually run the tests here that I've got. Guess what? I'm using make for this project. Take that, grunt gulp. Just kidding. Make is awesome because it's simple. Did you not see this? Oh, you can't see this. I need to look at this screen instead of my screen. All right. So we've got 3 tests in here because I extensively test my code. I make sure I cover every corner case. And these 3 tests do all of that. That's a joke. OK. Thank you. I really appreciate your laughter. All right. So we've got tests that say, should render the loading text when the promise is unresolved, should render the error text when the promise is rejected, and should show transcluded data when the promise is resolved. These are 3 basic things. We just want to say, we want to make sure our directive is working exactly how we think it is. And if any code changes, we want to know if this breaks. Now, it sounds confusing at first, but it's really not that bad. Let's open up our spec file here. Spec, Mr. Box spec. Here are the steps. I wrote them down in a nice little comment so we could all see it. Steps to unit testing a custom directive. First, declare the module that the directive is instantiated on. And that we do right here. Before each module, Mr. Directives. Okay? That's where it's specified. So we're going to load that in the test. Has anyone tested Angular code before? Yes. I hope so. Excellent. Great. Okay. So in case you're not down with it, Angular comes with some tools to make testing a little easier. So this module is actually calling a global function that's injected as part of ng-mock or Angular mock. So that's not voodoo magic. It is voodoo magic, but it's not like weird Murphy-Randle voodoo magic. It's Angular voodoo magic. Okay, so we we define the module there. That's step 1 is done. Okay. Next, we need to inject the compile and root scope services into our test so that we can use them. And that is done right here. Before each, inject function, compile root scope, and I'm also injecting Q because I need to use it for promises. Okay. And now, if you're not familiar with this, Angular knows that we need to do this, so it's set up a special thing so that we can declare compile root scope and Q up outside of the function, and then we can inject the same services but wrap them with underscores so we don't end up with variable collisions. It's fine. It understands that. It knows that it'll strip off trailing and leading underscores whenever the injector is looking for an object to inject. Okay? So we inject compile, root scope, and Q and assign all of those to globally or to objects that are available to our entire describe function. Step 2 is done. Step 3, this all goes inside the test. Okay? We need to compile, or we need to make a string that represents the element we're going to test and compile it against the root scope. Just give it a scope to compile against. It doesn't have to be the root scope. Okay? And we do that right here. It should render loading text when promise is unresolved. We're going to take the root scope, and we're going to define, oh, don't look at that right now. That's ahead. We're going to say var elem is compile this string. So here you'll see the string is mr box, and we set a load message here, and we set a resolve function, and we close it off. That's what's here. Okay, so this resolve function is defined on the root scope in the test. Root scope foo function is a function, and we return a promise unresolved because I want to test the loading state. So I'm never going to resolve this promise in this test. Just going to say you are pending forever. Never make any progress. And okay, so I define that string. We compile it, and then we call that compiled string on the root scope, and that gives us an element that's our custom directive already compiled and linked into like, I don't know, it's not really a DOM. It's kind of a virtual DOM, but don't react me. Just kidding, React is awesome. Okay, so we've got an element here, and then we're going to call digest on the scope, and that makes sure that the directive does what it's supposed to. Does the normal digest cycle that Angular's always doing its dirty checking to be able to do its magic two-way binding. And then we're going to just say expect the HTML of the element to contain the loading message, which is foo right there. And as you saw, it passes. Awesome, that's great. Let's just look at the other ones really quick. The error message is the same thing. We do the exact same thing, except for we give it an error message, and we reject the function that we pass in. And then the very last test is to make sure that the transclusion works. And so we create a fulfilling promise here. We pass in something inside the custom directive string. My brain is starting to slow down a little bit. And then we check to make sure that that is inside the test. So it's as simple as that. In just a few steps, we've got some tests to make sure that we don't go crazy when we make some changes in the future and break everything. We'll still go crazy, but at least we'll know why we're going crazy, or that we're going crazy. That's the end. That's the end of my talk. Thanks. And I'm willing to accept questions if anyone has them. No questions. Either that means I did a terrible job, or I did a really good job and everyone understands everything.
Okay, how do you feel about directives and how complex they should be?
Is this a loaded question? Yeah. Are you asking me if we should all switch to React?
I have opinions about this, and I'm not a React guy.
Because yes, we should all switch to React.
No,
and Angular.
I'm committed to Angular.
Okay.
Completely.
Okay.
But I've run into a lot of trouble, and I've seen people write big directives. I haven't used Angular in a corporate setting in a big company. I wonder how you have approached it.
Okay, so this is actually a great question because I was thinking about the comparison between, not to bring up framework battle because that's not the point, but React does a really good job of making it very simple to declare a component, right? Yeah. A self-contained, easy to use component. And as I was thinking of the comparison between these two, I thought, boy, it'd sure be nice to do it the React way. That said, React does things completely differently. It's very, very different. But the ease of defining components makes you think about your app in a different way. And you can actually think of your Angular app that way too. Just say, well, I'm going to take my UI. This is one of the examples that the React people do. They say, take your Photoshop file from the designer, look at the modules that they've made, and then basically make your code follow that design because you're coding modules. You're not really coding anything but the modules that's going to be seen on the screen. So a great idea is to follow that along. And also a great idea is to make modules that match that same thing in Angular. Not modules, I'm sorry, directives. The thing that's discouraging is that it takes, like we just saw, 3 files and a bunch of lines to create even one directive. So I think that it's worth it, though, in the end. It's worth it, for one thing, though, to make your directives a little bit more abstract. Abstract them as much as possible so they can be reused. Because it's super easy in React to just say, I'm going to just make one directive for this specific thing and never reuse it again because it's so easy. Right. It costs a little bit more of your time and typing to do it in Angular. So maybe it's a good idea to abstract it a little bit more. But I still think it's very much worth it to use the directives, custom directives, anywhere possible.
Okay. So how many people work on your code base? How big is it?
I think just me.
Just you?
I think just me. No, I'm just kidding.
I've run into trouble with big code bases
Yeah.
that a lot of people are working on, and then people will start breaking the whole app into just directives.
Yeah.
I've run into trouble with that.
I'm actually maintaining an app that had very few directives and was mostly just ng-if and ng-show, and that proved to be a very complicated thing to read. Yeah. So I started going the directives module. So here I'll say, I don't know. I'd like to know. I'd like to know how that scales, because currently I'm moving to this directive place from a place with no directives, and it seems like a magical fairyland. And so that's what I'm headed to. But if it turns out to be like the dungeon where the dragons are, I don't know, maybe I'll just go get a job like planting flowers. That's a good idea, too.
You're going to the right place.
Oh, good. OK. Confirmation. Great. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah?
You had some voodoo that I'm curious about.
OK.
What test runner do you use? I think that's probably going to answer part of it. But you have module templates?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to cover that. Thank you for asking. I'm very interested to hear how you do it, too, because I think it's really annoying. First, let's talk about the problem, right? So I use Karma as the test runner because it's kind of what just comes, it's what expected to be used. I like to fit right there in the status quo. I'm just kidding. I'm using make and Karma. All right. So I'm using Karma. But the issue is that when you're testing a directive that doesn't have the template rendered straight in line, that actually calls out to a file, then Karma doesn't know how to render HTML. Right? It's just a JavaScript thing. So someone wrote a nice little module. And I'm going to have this code up online. So if you want to go afterward to look at it, you can see everything there. There's a nice little module that actually you declare in your Karma config. Guess what? I can't read. There we go. You declare in your Karma config your view, or all your views that you want to be imported. And then down here, it's called ng-HTML2JS preprocessor. Say that 3 times fast. All right. You can configure that. And what that'll do is that'll actually go and read the HTML. It'll compile it into JavaScript templates, and it'll put it in Angular's template cache. So that when you call it, which is right here, I'm defining a templates module. It sticks it in a module for you. And so I load the templates module, and all of a sudden, when I call the template cache with that URL for the template, it's loaded already for me, so I don't get an error. That's one thing.
I do a very similar thing, but the paths don't line up for me, so I have to actually just declare them one at a time and say this one matches that. Okay, but yours is just.
Yeah, that actually might be fixed with the strip prefix attribute and also giving a module name, and they all just get dropped right in there. Okay. Awesome. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious, when do you decide to use link versus controller in your directive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this gets helped a little bit when you think about the the life cycle of a directive. And I'm not an expert on this by any means, but as far as I understand it, when the directive gets read by Angular's bootstrap cycle, there's a compile. You can pass in a compile function. And that compile function is what happens when Angular realizes that it's parsing your directive from the page, and you can do some modifications to the DOM before anything runs. And that's kind of like a class. What am I thinking? I better not say Java things or I might get lynched, right? It's kind of like an attribute on a class. So anything that you do in the compile function, I believe, applies to all of the instances of your directive. Then you got the link, pre and post link functions. I didn't know that there are 2 link functions, but there are pre and post link. So typically, when you just define link, it's the post link function, which means that your directive has been copied, instantiated, and hooked up to something on the scope and on the page. And that's where you want to do kind of like your jQuery stuff. Or that's where you can, because you get references to the elements and the attributes, just like you do in the controller. But there is a difference, and I am not versed into what the difference is. Then the controller is running it runs at runtime. That makes total sense. It runs after the post-link function, and that's the only difference that I know of is I believe that you don't have access to the scope when you're in the link. Do you?
Well, you do. The big difference is your controller you can access from other directives, and you can export your API via the controller. You can't do that with the link.
That's right. There you go. Question answered by fantastic Chris. Great. Sorry, I wasn't prepared for that one.
What kind of energy drink do you use?
It's called water. No, really. If I drink Coke, I'm like, ah. I have a guy at work that's trying to get me to drink NOS. He's like, it's the best stuff. I'm like, I would die if I tried to drink that stuff. No, I typically drink water and also raw milk. It doesn't kill you, just so you know. I did have some A&W because there was no water here, and so that's probably why I'm really, yeah, I was like, oh, sugar, it's great. Okay, any other questions? Awesome. Thanks for coming to listen to me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, let's talk really quick. My name is Kenzie Dodds. I'm that guy right there. And just a quick announcement. I'm doing this thing with this guy right here. His name is Todd Moto, called ng-aria. And it's, if you're familiar with Hangouts on Air, it's basically like a broadcast on YouTube. And if you're familiar with like JavaScript Jabber or Adventures in Angular podcast, this is going to be very much like that. It's a video podcast, so it's a Hangout on Air. Todd and I are the hosts, and then our first episode is with these four gentlemen, members of the Angular core team, talking about 1.3 and 2.0. We're super stoked about it, and it's this Friday. So if you go to ng-aria.github.io, then you can find like all the information that you need, and you can RSVP to the Google Plus event, which is the Hangout on Air, right here. And then you can watch it when we're ready to start. So, and then also, like, if you have any questions for the Angular team, like, why do you hate us because 2.0 is so different? And they'll be like, we love you. But you can ask your questions here, and you can vote for other people's questions, and we'll discuss those during the show. So that was just a quick little thing I wanted to. It's ng-aria.github.io. And let's see if maybe we've got Google stuff. No. Oh, yeah, we are. ng-aria. Just Google that. You'll find us there. Sweet. Whoever said an Angular app doesn't have SEO? Okay, cool. So my lightning talk is not about ng-aria. My lightning talk is about ng-aria. And it's this sweet new directive or module for Angular 1.3. I actually, let's really quickly, let's change my Angular version to 1.2.20. Yeah, it appears that it works with older versions of Angular as well. So, but I'm going to be using 1.3 because that one's better. So basically, if you're not familiar with ARIA, it stands for accessible, let's see, I forget, accessibility-rich internet applications. And basically what that means is there are people on this planet who cannot see or cannot hear or cannot, like, who have disabilities that make it difficult for them to interact with your web application, and there's a lot of them out there who want to use your web application. And so ARIA is this really cool thing in HTML that helps the technologies that help them use your application. So like we have screen readers, and yeah, there are a myriad of technologies that are used to help people who have those disabilities. And ng-aria makes dealing with ARIA a lot easier with Angular, because when you say, hey, Angular, here's an input, and it's bound to this value, and it's of this type, and there are these different things, you're telling Angular all these things. Angular knows a lot about your model that you're showing to the user and inviting them to interact with. And so Angular can take what it knows about your model and apply the appropriate ARIA attributes to your HTML for you automatically. So first, let's just really quickly look at what the application looks like. So we have a bunch of form controls here, and below I just have a little directive that's looking at the form control and showing you the attributes that are on it, like on the HTML. So here, we'll just really quickly, oh my gosh, that didn't do what I thought it would do. Let's go to the full page. Okay, so, oh, dang it, now it's gone. That's okay. So, embiggen, yep. Oh, wrong embiggen. There you go. Okay, so here we have a text area. It has an ng model and a class and an ARIA multiline and tab index. So that's what you're seeing here. That's all I wanted to show you, so that the directive works. So if we go back and we'll debiggen a little bit here, and we'll remove you. Okay, so if we go here, and now I've removed ng-aria from my dependency, so I'm not loading ng-aria. This is what your like basic HTML attributes look like on these different form controls. So you have your ng model, and you have your class, and Angular's adding all this stuff, and it's really cool. And so you have each of these form controls. You have this thing that's shown and hidden. So let's add ng-aria and see what that gives to us. ng-aria. So now I have ng-aria loaded on the page, and I'm loading the ng-aria module into my app here. So and that's all that I need to do to get all of these attributes applied automatically for me. You don't need to do anything else to make your web application just a little bit more accessible, which is really nice. So now we have this ARIA invalid that's going to help the screen reader. We have this tab index that helps with using the keyboard. We have ARIA checked, and you can kind of toggle between those two. It also automatically will change the tab index for you. You have your checkbox and your range, and here you have the value now. You have the mix and min and max. You have ARIA hidden for things that are shown and hidden. So this is an input of type email, and so ARIA invalid is false because it doesn't have anything in it, but now it's now invalid because that's not a valid email. But if I say at gmail.com, now it is valid, so ARIA invalid is false. And then this is required, and so it says ARIA required is true, and it's invalid because it's required, and so then we enter something in, now it's valid. So, and then disabled as well, ARIA disabled. So anyway, I would encourage you to look at, if you're on a Mac, then you have VoiceOver utility, and that's what lots of people on Mac computers who have disabilities will use to use your internet application. So open up your app and turn on VoiceOver, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, nobody can use my app who can't see. What? Oh, dang. VoiceOver, actually, I'm pretty sure that it works in Chrome. Probably not as well. You're probably right. So anyway, yeah, definitely encourage you to do that. I also encourage you to look at this video, AngularJS Accessibility by Marcy Sutton at NG Europe 2014. I read it to you even though I know you can read. But definitely recommend looking at that. It's a terrific video. And I would just say ng-aria is awesome, but it's not a replacement for thinking about accessibility in your application. And so, yeah, let's care about people and think about accessibility in our apps. That's it.
Hello. All right, whatever. So, try to be really quick, lightning fast, because we're pretty much out of time. Hi, Daniel. I haven't seen him in like years, so. So I don't know, just really quick, has anybody ever heard of Sweet Alert? It's been trending on GitHub for like ever now. And at first I was skeptical, and then I realized that I really loved it. And it like fit in perfectly with a lot of formatting and color schemes and layout that I was already using. So if you haven't seen Sweet Alert, it is a replacement for JavaScript's kind of default alert system. So instead of getting something really ugly, you get something very pretty. And Sweet Alert's really cool. It's written in pretty much just plain old JavaScript. But one thing really annoyed me about it is that it didn't have promises. And I hate passing in functions as parameters now. After using Angular, it feels really dirty. I did find another ng Sweet Alert service out there. It was pretty much just a wrapper around it. It didn't give any new functionality at all. So I built ng Sweet Alert in like 10 minutes, and it's really lightweight. In fact, it's tiny. It's that big right there. So, but it's really nice because it gives you the promises that you need, so you can then on a confirmation from Sweet Alert, or you can catch the cancel that people use, and it proves to be really nice when you're using it in production, because you don't have to go through all this parameter junk. You can just then, and if you have like a a statement that says "Are you sure?" type of thing, it fits right in with your promise chain. So a little demo, tiny demo. You can say hello with it. It works just like the Sweet Alert does. All the syntax and everything's the same on it. So you can pass in titles, and is that big enough? There. So you can override defaults if you want, just with the built-in Sweet Alert stuff. It exposes an NZ swal, which is the shorthand Sweet Alert function. You pass in titles and types, and if you want to show cancel buttons and what the confirmed text is, and you even pass in stuff for your default colors if you want. And so you get really nice confirmation buttons and animations with pretty much anything you want. And they're so easy to manipulate when you actually have promises. So you can say, are you sure? Are you really sure? Are you insane? I guess so. Promises rock. Or, okay, weak. So it's very useful, and it looks so much better in your code to have promise chains that can just feed off of ng Sweet Alert instead of having to use parameters. So that's the first little bit of it. Maybe that's trivial for you, but I love it. So that's at nozzle/ng Sweet Alert. I work for Nozzle, so shameless plug. The second thing, and in production, kind of this is how I've been using it. It works really nicely if you have something and you're monitoring for changes, and never mind, are you sure you want to discard your changes? Yes. If you navigate away from pages, it's a lot nicer to get something like that instead of are you sure you want to navigate away from this page, kind of built-in stuff. So it's very handy. The second thing that I wanted to show was, I talked about it at the Angular SLC meetup, but I love modularization, and I love that concept. I'm so new to it, but I've just embraced it completely. And Kent took me down this crazy road of being completely modular in everything that I do. And so I'm really caught on to that. And one thing that I'm doing right now is, one thing that really annoyed me is if anybody's used an image in their project, usually you have to reference, the full file path in your template, where it is, and then if you've ever changed your file structure around, which if you read any Angular style guide, your file structure will change immediately. Mine has changed like 30 times. But trying to keep track of all those URLs in your templates gets so tedious and so find and replacey, and I hate it. So basically what I've done is I have modularized not only with the Angular modules, but also with file structure. And I've also created some shortcuts to help me out. So if you were actually looking right here, I'm going to make this bigger. I wish I could Command plus my Finder. That would be awesome. That's better, right? OK. So say you have an app, and you've got the path to this thing that you're working on. And you could have it adopt whatever Angular style guide you want, or maybe some custom one that you've built. Maybe you have a module folder, and that's your module declares your module is declared right here. But you can have sub-modules. If things are dependent on one another, you can create your structure and your file structure, and you can mimic it in your code as well. So in this scenario, my main module right here is my app.things. And let's just skip that part for now. But I actually tack right onto the module some parameters, or some properties. So .paths gives me a root, a partials, a sub, and whatever else you want to know where that module is in your files. And then you can do whatever you need here, and you can actually reference that stuff in your module. And even if you wanted, you could tack that on to a constant or a value in your app and use it in your partials, so that instead of calling path to this thing partials or images and getting your image, you can just reference this. Hey, you know what? I need the images folder for this module, and then I need the image. And that way, anytime your file structure changes, you can change it here, and you know everything's going to be there. And it gets even cooler, because then in your second module over here, say this is a child module, you not only define the module, but you define the parent. Not in a sense of saying this is a new module, but let me wrap that really quick. So it's not a new module. You're just referencing it as a parent. And then you can actually use those paths in the submodule. So they're aware of their parents. They're aware of where they are in the file structure. You just have to change one thing, and everything is going to know exactly where it is in your file structure. And since I've done this, it saved me so much time just tracking down images and where they're linking. And I have a feeling that I haven't even used it to its full extent yet. And one of the use cases for us is that we are actually building a platform that other developers are going to be able to write their own Angular modules that depend on our platform. And we need a way to import those modules and for them to be able to reference files and images and all that sort of stuff in their own little kind of sandbox. And we can integrate it right into our app, integrate it into testing, integrate it with everything. And it just makes everything really smooth. So once again, maybe trivial, but it's helped me out a ton. So that's it. Oh, I don't have this structure stuff posted anywhere. If you're really interested, you can come and talk to me, and I believe Kent has implemented kind of one of his own as well, and I need to talk to him about it to see what he's done different. But yeah, I have yet to publish it anywhere.
All right, thanks everyone for coming out. We went a little bit long tonight, but it was really great talks, so hope you guys found it valuable. Since we went a little bit long and we lost some people, so to reward those that stayed around, I'm going to give away 2 memberships tonight to Front-End Masters. So I got the attendees list. I got a little script here in the console. It's going to randomly select people. If you see your name, let me know. Jonathan Swords. Going. Is he here? No? Okay. Robert Johnson? No? All right. Morgan Williams? Man, everyone took off. Morgan Williams. You sure? All right. What a guy. Jared Whipple. Jared. All right. All right. Come get in touch with me afterwards. We'll get you hooked up. Brandon Beeks. Alex Brown. Simon. Jana Flynn. All right, cool. You guys come up and talk to me afterwards. Thanks for coming out. I'm not 100% sure where we're going to be next month. We might still be here. I'll let you know once we know for sure. Anyway, thank you guys for coming out. See you guys next month.